All right, so we're back and we're going to talk about neural pools slash neural circuitry here. So, oops, sorry, I accidentally tapped my mic. I hope that wasn't too loud. So what you're seeing here are obviously models for different ways that neurons can structurally organize their synapses. So we've got a variety of different kinds of circuits. And when I talk about circuits, this is another way that neurons and their axons and their connections are similar to consumer electronics. So the way our electronics work is there are multiple circuits along which electrons flow, and they interlock with each other, and there's multiple structural levels of circuitry that build up to whatever the function of the electronic is. And those circuitry organizations can take a variety of patterns, and it's the same with neuronal pools or neuronal circuits. So each of these different types of spatial arrangements of these have a name, and places where you tend to find them slash stuff that typifies what that particular structural arrangement is for. So let's have a look and see what we got here. So you might recall that earlier we spoke about interneurons, and I first introduced them in the spinal cord, but of course there are oodles and oodles of them in the cerebral cortex as well. So remember, inter means between. So interneurons are neurons which allow other neurons to talk to each other. And there's just tons and tons of interneurons. So sets means sets of interneurons all speaking to each other in one big, huge neuronal pool. So the output in general, and of course this is going to be very, very general because in order to be specific about this, I would have to talk about the specific function of each individual network or subnetwork of neurons. And I'm not going to do that here because this isn't neuroscience class, unfortunately, so that's beyond our scope. But in general, the computations that neuronal pools are doing is using input, typically afferent information about internal or external conditions, and calculating and making decisions and computations about that input to produce some output, which typically is going to either stimulate, so upregulate, or depress or suppress, downregulate activity in another part of the CNS. So an example of that might be there's a structure in your brain called the reticular formation, and part of the reticular formation's job is to suppress your somatic motor activity while you're sleeping. And that is specifically designed to help you not sleepwalk and thus endanger yourself while you're asleep. So the reticular formation neuronal pools would be gathering information about you being asleep, and then the output would be depressing the activity of somatic motor neurons so that you don't, walk and throw yourself down the stairs, for example. So the effects of this include, but are not limited to, interpretation of sensory information and coordination of motor commands. There are other, of course, neuronal pools as well that do things like consolidate memories, form memories, move things from short-term memory into long-term memory, make decisions, experience emotions. So these are cognitive things, but the broadest effects are listed here. Okay, so I mentioned that all of these patterns that you see, the structural arrangements, have names. That's what we will be getting to next. So this is an overview. We've got a variety of different patterns that can be used to achieve different outcomes depending on how they're arranged. So these include diverging circuits, where one signal is amplified and ends up being propagated by many neurons. We've got converging circuits, which is where All right, sorry about that momentary little technology glitch. My screen recorder is supposed to go into minimized mode, but it's not doing that, so I'll just live with it. So converging circuits are ones in which multiple neurons talk to a single one, and that functions to de-amplify or reduce a signal. Serial, parallel, and reverberating. So let's look at each of these and talk about what the significance of them is. So divergence is specialized to permit broad distribution of information. So if we look here, we can see that neuron A is sending 2 axon collaterals. Now note there's only ever one axon, but there can be collaterals. So to neurons B and C. And then neurons B and C can each send that signal down the line to neurons D, E, F, G, H, and I, for example. And then if each of these neurons down here have multiple axon collaterals, what started as an action potential propagating along the axon of one neuron is now many action potentials propagated along the axons of a great number of neurons. So examples of where we use this are in visual sensory information. So this is one of the ways that we link our vision and our balance. So we learned about the vestibular system in lab and how that contributes to detection of positioning and acceleration, and the role of vision in that as well. So we detect whether we are moving or our surroundings are moving, and our spatial orientation relative to those surroundings to do things like balance, maintain an upright posture, etc. And so divergence is one of the ways that all of these signals are coordinated together to produce the output of you having stable, balanced posture, coordinating both vision and vestibular sense. Okay, so convergence is the opposite of divergence. It's essentially when many neurons all input onto a single one. So we can see here we've got neurons A, B, C, and D, and they're all synapsing on one neuron, which is F. I skipped E, but it doesn't matter. This is F. So this might seem like, having seen divergence, you might be wondering like, well, what utility would this have if we're reducing a signal? Why would you even need all these neurons if we're just going to have the output be one thing? That's a great question. So there's a lot of different ways that this can manifest. So one example that you'll learn more about next term is the subconscious and conscious origins of breathing actions. So actions that are specifically executed by the diaphragm. And you know from breathing that you can breathe voluntarily and voluntarily modify your breath pattern. So you could hyperventilate, you can fake laugh, any number of things. But when you go to sleep, even though you are not consciously aware of anything, you still breathe, fortunately. And so that suggests that something has to be controlling and coordinating those patterns. So convergence states that a number of inputs are going to determine whether you are controlling your diaphragm voluntarily or involuntarily. And intercostal muscles are also involved, but generally the idea is you have a combination of inputs from presynaptic neurons, and those inputs are going to be a mixture of excitatory and inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, and those are summed up to determine the action of this particular neuron. And sometimes it's useful to do that when you are trying to split an important motor action between consciousness and subconsciousness. That's just one example. There are others. I'll give you an example of another converging circuit actually right now. Why not? So let's switch over to Blackboard mode for a minute. So we'll talk more about the retina of the eye when we get to chapter 17, but you've already learned a little bit of it in lab. And so what you might remember is that I'm just going to draw a couple of these because I don't want to waste a bunch of time drawing a lot of them. So here I have a cone, and then maybe I have another cone. These are our outer segments. And then each of these has its own little attachment. These, I'm not going to call them axons because they're not actually axons, but they are an area of the sensory cell that is going to be able to release neurotransmitter in response to being excited by light. So all of these are providing output to one or two bipolar neurons. So in this case, I'm going to make it 2. So the dendrites of the bipolar neurons are linking up to the rods and cones, and then they are sending their input on their axons to a ganglion cell. And the ganglion cell dendrites are innervated by more than one bipolar cell, and then they send out axons that end up exiting via the optic nerve. So this is an example of a converging circuit because the initial source of the signal, light exciting these cone cells, we have 1, 2, 3 cells, and those are providing input to only 2 cells downstream, and then all of that input is fed to 1 cell before the visual signal leaves the retina in the form of an action potential. So this is converging where we have many excitable cells on this end of the spectrum and only 1 on this end. Oops. So that is one other example of converging circuits and where you might find one. So we'll learn more about why that is later. So serial processing. Serial is a way to say one after another. So serialized dramas, for example, is a radio or television drama that is episodic. So there's a sequence of episodes that you must watch in order for them to make sense. That's serialization. So this is a case where we just have a 1-to-1 ratio where one neuron talks to one other neuron and then maybe another one downstream. So it's a game of neural telephone where neuron A tells neuron B to tell neuron C something, something. So examples of this, we're actually going to see a lot of these when we get to chapter 15, which is the pathways chapter. So for example, pain sensations traveling into the CNS are linear, and that's one of the ways that you can reliably understand not only that pain is happening, but what specific location is experiencing pain, because that's how you get that part of your body away from the painful stimulus. So you don't want a converging or diverging circuit there because that would muddy the ability to figure out where the pain was coming from. You just want a serial arrangement so that the signal is arriving where it's supposed to and its origination point is very clear. So we'll look at a lot more of that stuff when we get to chapter 15. Parallel processing is kind of the opposite of serial. So instead of one after another, we've got the initiation of multiple action potentials at the same time. So time is a factor here. And all of them are in parallel to each other, as you can see from these parallel arrows. So sometimes these kinds of neuronal pools that use parallel processing are part of redundant systems where there's some information, typically afferent information, and this information could be used in more than one way. And so in order to distribute it and also make sure that it's adequately processed by all of the pieces of the pool that need to process it, several neurons or even several pools of neurons are going to just process that same information simultaneously, resulting in action potentials that originate on different neurons, but at the same time, and all travel down their respective axons in parallel. So this allows responses to be coordinated in time, for example. So if we have co-occurring responses, this is a timing mechanism where if I have one piece of afferent information that requires several responses, and all of those responses must occur simultaneously, parallel processing is a great way to get that done. So even though it may seem a little bit simplistic, it definitely has its uses. So this is another thing that we'll get to when we get more into not only pathways information, but reflex arcs. For example, consider the fact that when you step on a sharp object, you have to do two things at the same time. Thing one is you have to pull your foot off of the sharp object, but thing number two is you have to stabilize the leg that you are standing on so that when you pull your foot off the sharp object, you don't fall down because you're standing on your other leg. And so activating the flexors on one leg and the extensors on the other leg to achieve standing on one foot requires parallel processing. And we'll look at more of those reflex arcs in detail. And finally, my favorite kind of neuronal circuit is a reverberating one. So this one is pretty nifty because what you have is a setup where, due to the presence of axon collaterals, so we have collateral 1 and collateral 2, neuron A excites neuron B, excites neuron C, so now we have the signal that can go off to some other place and be useful. But if we need to have this signal persist even after the stimulus has gone away, we can use this axon collateral to just re-excite neuron A, and the sequence happens over again. So this is a really handy thing. It's also an example of a positive feedback loop, so a self-perpetuating signal. And in general, these are going to, you must be thinking, well, how does this stop then, right? Because if activation of neuron B is going to always activate C and reactivate A, then where's the off switch for that? How do you make it go away? So the answer is either synaptic fatigue, which we haven't really talked much about, but synaptic fatigue is basically when you run out of neurotransmitter at a particular synapse. And so you need time for it to build back up or get put back into the axon terminal and reassembled, etc. So that is a thing that's definitely possible and does happen. Or you can also have inhibition of the initial neuron. So maybe there's another neuron over here that releases inhibitory postsynaptic potentials in response to some stuff. And when this one fires, it tells A to stop. So examples of things that use reverberating circuits, and sometimes many reverberating circuits that interact with each other or are in parallel: consciousness, memory. So remember our friend the hippocampus. One of the things that it does to consolidate memory is to use reverberating circuits to resynthesize the event or thing that you're trying to remember and play it back to your own brain over and over again to reinforce the memory before moving it into storage. Muscular coordination is another one of these things that involves reverberating feedback as well as consciousness, and also breathing. So these are just some examples. There are many others, but it's nice to have some context for what this weird looking arrangement of synapses might achieve functionally. Okay, reflexes. So what you're seeing here is the patellar reflex. And the reflexes that we're going to be talking about here are going to be, at least initially, pretty basic reflex involving the somatic nervous system and the spinal cord. And most of them are preventative, so they're designed to prevent injury from occurring, injury of any kind. So how do we define a reflex? Well, reflexes are automatic responses to a very specific stimulus. And by automatic, what I mean is hardwired and involuntary. So you might be thinking, well, but this is the somatic nervous system. I thought that was voluntary. And the answer is usually it is. But there are some situations in which we can override that voluntary control to prevent harm from coming to us. And typically these reflexes are specific. So in the case of the patellar ligament, essentially if you concentrate force on the patellar ligament, which is this guy right here, because remember ligaments connect bones to bones. Because the patellar ligament is so critical in stabilizing your knee joint and your leg, we do not want this thing to rip. So if it gets hit with a little mallet, which simulates a lot of force being put on one particular part of the patellar ligament, that is detected via the tendon organs in your rectus femoris, and the output is to relieve the perceived tension on the patellar ligament by causing you to activate your rectus femoris and kick out to put some slack on your patellar ligament so it isn't at risk of tearing. So we'll look at other kinds of reflexes like these, but the important thing is if there is some kind of challenge to homeostasis that could potentially harm you or make you sick, we want to provide very, very rapid, real-time adjustments so that we go back to homeostasis and we're safe. So one clinical application of this patellar ligament and tendon example is featured here is assessing nervous system damage. So if I'm a clinician and I'm trying to figure out whether my patient has had some damage to their nervous system and whether that damage is on the afferent or efferent side, I might start by just checking some of their reflexes to see if the reflexes are intact. And if they're not, that would provide me with some information about what might be wrong with my patient. So we'll move through that and apply that a little bit later. So a reflex arc is just the sequence of events from stimulus to motor output and the neurons on which they travel. So we call this a pathway. So pathways can include lots of other fancy stuff if it's coordinating the central and peripheral nervous system, for example, but reflex arcs are the simplest pathway. So they're very, very basic. They begin at a receptor, in this case, the muscle spindle and Golgi tendon organ associated with the rectus femoris. So we've got our receptor here, and then they end at an effector. And in this case, the effector is the muscle in which that muscle spindle proprioreceptor sits. And you'll notice that in this particular reflex arc, there is only one synapse. So usually we would expect to see a sensory neuron synapsing on some population of cell bodies in the dorsal gray horn. But in the case of reflex arcs, that's an exception because we don't have time for interneurons to talk about whether or not we should do an action. We have to have the action done now. So this would be classified as a monosynaptic reflex arc, meaning one that contains only one synapse. So here's another example. In this case, we have someone who is setting their hand on a thumbtack. And this is going to be a painful stimulus. And a lot of these things are going to start with a painful stimulus because pain suggests tissue damage and we want to avoid that. So here we have our little stimulus. And in this case, the sensory neuron is going to be a pain fiber. So let's just put a little reminder up here for ourselves. Pain equals tissue damage. We want to avoid that. So in this case, we have a pain fiber, and it's worth noting, and we'll talk more about this in other chapters, you have neurons that are sensory neurons, and they're only for detecting pain. They don't carry any other kind of signal. And that's important because if pain equals tissue damage and we're trying to avoid that, then we need to have our pain signal be unambiguous. So we need to know specifically where it's coming from so we can get that part of our body away from the painful stimulus. And we need to know the nature of the tissue damage at least as much as we can. And we also need to be able to know that this is pain that's occurring and not just some other sense like pressure or vibration or just being touched. It's pain and we have to do something about it. So the sensory neuron carries that action potential up along its axon, passing its cell body in the dorsal root ganglion and entering in the dorsal gray horn. In this case, we have a polysynaptic reflex where there's more than one synapse, so it's going to synapse on an interneuron here. And that interneuron has two collaterals. The first collateral is going to, of course, activate via a motor neuron in the ventral root an effector, which is going to pull our hand away from the painful stimulus. But it would also be good to let the brain know what's going on. So simultaneously, the signal is ascending in a portion of the lateral white column to just let the brain know, hey, a painful stimulus occurred and a reflex was done about it. And you notice that if we look carefully, we can see that this part of the pathway is on the same side as the stimulus. And then, let's make this a different color. This part of the pathway is on the opposite side from the stimulus. So there are names for these. The name for same side as is ipsilateral. And the name for opposite side is contralateral. I have to move my little toolbar here. There we go. So we'll come back to that later because depending on what the nature of the reflex is, they can either be only ipsilateral, only contralateral, or they can be, like in this case, a combination of both. So we'll see some more examples as we move along. Okay, so how do we classify reflexes? There's lots of different ways. So each of these little titles is one scheme or feature by which they can be classified. So development means are they innate, which means they are determined genetically and passed down, or are they acquired, meaning learned at some point. So some of the innate reflexes, for example, like the Babinski sign and others, are used when obstetrician is evaluating a newly delivered baby for any abnormality. And so they'll check the baby's reflexes as a proxy for seeing if the infant has any malformations of the nervous system, just checking to make sure all the reflexes are intact. Response is another one. So somatic reflexes, which are the ones we were just looking at, so those are going to control skeletal muscle contractions, although again, not necessarily voluntarily. And these include superficial and stretch reflexes. So the stretch reflex is an example of that would be, of course, the patellar reflex. And then visceral reflexes, yes, there are ones of these as well, and these are going to control actions of any effector that is not somatic. So for example, actions of smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, glands and adipose tissue. Glands include sweat glands. If the signal is that the ambient temperature is really high, sweat glands will be activated via a visceral reflex arc. So we also talked about complexity of circuit, so mono versus polysynaptic. And the counting here is really easy. It's either mono, which is one, or anything that's more than one is considered poly. So 2 to several hundred, it really just depends on the reflex. And also finally, processing site. So spinal reflexes are processed in the spinal cord, so interneurons in the gray matter. And cranial reflexes are processed in the brain, again in the gray matter, so interneurons in the cortex and nuclei. So here's another example of a monosynaptic reflex. We already looked at this one. It's the patellar reflex. So the benefit of monosynaptic reflexes is that there's almost no delay in the pathway, which allows us to correct the aberration to homeostasis really, really quickly. So stretch reflexes are, this is not the only one that exists, there are others, but when there is rapid and very intense stretch, what that would mean is the structural integrity of the ligament or tendon is threatened. And so how do we relieve the tension? Well, we contract a muscle to pull the ligament or tendon into a more relaxed position. So that's what we're seeing here. So in this case, the receptor is the muscle spindle, which is a proprioceptive sensory organ in our skeletal muscles, which basically provide information to the central nervous system about if the muscle is being stretched. So let's have a closer look at muscle spindles. So these are going to monitor tension in the muscle and also stretch. So this provides information about, is this muscle currently contracting? How much is it contracting? Is it maximal? Is it minimal? Is it medial? What's the tone like? And because we don't want our sarcomeres to come completely apart, right? Because remember, if we don't have any cross bridges, we can't generate any tension. That means that overstretching of a muscle is dangerous and it potentially will injure us. So if we are stretching the muscle, that means that the muscle spindle will also get stretched, and that sends afferent information to the CNS, which produces the opposite response. So rapid stretch, the response to that is rapid contraction. So now let's look at some polysynaptic reflexes. So in this example, we have somebody who is grabbing onto a hot cast iron pan. And in this case, that painful stimulus is not overstretching, it's burning, which is dangerous because that's a very bad kind of tissue damage that it's hard to recover from. So we want to get our hand off of this painful stimulus right away. So before I explain this, I think we've all accidentally touched something that was too hot. And so what I'm going to do is just mentally take you through what did and didn't happen when we all accidentally touched the hot thing. So when you put your hand on the hot pan, or you forgot that you were letting the glass cooktop cool and you leaned your hand on it, what happened was you leaned your hand on it or set your hand down and immediately, in a jerky motion, withdrew your hand from the painful stimulus and experienced some pain, but hopefully not a severe burn because you got your hand away fast enough. That all happened relatively automatically. Here's what didn't happen. You didn't grab the hot pan, experience the pain, and think to yourself, oh, this is a painful stimulus. It is damaging my tissue. I should remove my hand from the painful stimulus so I don't damage my tissue, and then let go. You don't have time for all of that cognition about that particular problem, and fortunately, we have reflexes that are designed to prevent our little primate brain from allowing us to hurt ourselves by just taking thinking out of the equation. No thinking for you, you just are programmed to let go. But with reflexes like this, we have a problem. So the problem is that we have on either side of our humerus, or either side of our femur as well, flexors on one side and extensors on the other. And flexors and extensors have opposite actions. So what I mean by that is if you were to activate both muscle groups at the same time and do so forcefully, it wouldn't produce the motion required to get you away from the painful stimulus, and it could even injure you if you activated them forcefully enough. So in a case where we need to produce an action that moves our hand away from the painful stimulus, we're going to have to activate the muscle group that achieves that and inhibit the muscle group that opposes that first muscle group. So we want to stimulate our flexors, in this case, our biceps brachii primarily, and meanwhile, we also want to inhibit our triceps brachii so that we can allow our biceps to reduce the angle of our elbow and move our hand away from the painful stimulus. So these are obviously more complex because one signal, our pain signal here, has to produce two different outcomes. And in addition to that, we have to send information about that outcome set to the central nervous system. So this is definitely polysynaptic. So if we go in and count our synapses, we can see 1, 2, 3, 4, and then up here, probably 5, 6, 7, 8 as it makes its way through the thalamus to the sensory cortex. So that's a lot of synapses, but we have to do this, otherwise the reflex would not get coordinated properly and we would risk stimulating the wrong muscle group or both at the same time and achieving no action whatsoever. So this is a simple example of that, where all of this is occurring in the same limb, but the result is let go of the pan, bend our elbow, get our hand away from the hot thing. Meanwhile, we have our extensors inhibited, and that is basically just preventing our triceps from firing at the same time. So this is a flexor reflex. Now here we have an even more complicated polysynaptic reflex involving stepping on a sharp tack. So this is the one I mentioned earlier, where in addition to moving your foot off of the painful stimulus, you also have to stabilize the leg that you're standing on, otherwise you're going to fall down and maybe right back onto that painful stimulus. So we can't have that. So this particular one we call the crossed extensor reflex, because if you notice and look carefully at this picture, we can see that on one leg, the extensors, which in this case are the quadriceps, are inhibited, and the flexors, are stimulated. On the other leg, we have the opposite. So we have our extensor stimulated to put tension in our knee and stabilize our leg, and our flexors are inhibited because we want to stand on this leg. So this, of course, involves pools of interneurons. So here we can see one interneuron is actually activating another interneuron. And that interneuron is going to tell the opposite side what to do, even as the first interneuron is acting on the other muscle group on the opposite leg. So what we notice is that even though this interneuron is going to respond to this single painful stimulus by causing our flexors to bend our knee and move our leg away, meanwhile inhibiting the extensors, it's also going to send information across to the other side. So that's decussation, or moving of a signal from one side of the brain and body to another. And then that information is going to rise up the spinal cord along with the information that just, hey, a painful stimulus is occurring. And the inhibitory information is also going to do the same thing. So we call these reflexes intersegmental because they involve greater than one spinal segment. So what we get in this case is something called reciprocal inhibition, which is, again, just a fancy way of saying extensors and flexors are inhibited and stimulated opposite to what the other leg is doing. Now, if necessary, and in this case it would be because we want to keep standing on this leg so we don't have our balance challenged, reverberating circuits elsewhere add to this response, prolonging the response. So after the initial jerking of your foot away from the tack, reverberating circuits are going to continue to reinforce the muscular actions happening in your standing leg so you don't fall back down. So this is a polysynaptic reflex that has a very, very specific action that is both moving your tissue away from the painful and damaging stimulus while also allowing you to remain upright, thus requiring both inhibition and stimulation, and requiring both sides of the spinal cord and both legs, and multiple muscle groups on both legs to boot. So we also have sets of reflexes that are not, oh no, move your body away from the painful stimulus reflexes, but rather motor patterns. So ways of moving that are repetitious and help us do things like balance our weight while we're walking. So we can divide movement in general into two categories: reflexive, which is below consciousness, so not voluntary, or voluntary, which are initiated by the brain. So for some portions of what we even consider to be our voluntary movement, so if I get up and I go walk somewhere, I have decided that I'm going to get up and I'm going to go walk. So that seems really voluntary to me. However, when I'm walking, I'm not walking along thinking, okay, activate rectus femoris and pick leg up off the ground. Meanwhile, stabilizing the extensors on my grounded leg so I can remain upright. And then I'm going to fall forward onto the leg that I just picked up. And as I do that, I'm going to pick up the leg I was just standing on, and I'm going to activate my quads to pick that knee up and reposition it to go forward. And I'm going to do that. And while I do that, I'm also going to swing my arms opposite to my leg so I don't fall down. None of those things are things that I think about consciously while I'm walking. I just have to initiate walking. And then walking happens relatively unconsciously for me. So I initiated walking, but the pre-existing patterns that I learned when I was little and I was learning to walk, and those patterns that were reinforced as I continued to walk and got better at it, these are handled by neuronal pools in the spinal cord. So coordinated, repetitious motor patterns that we may initiate, but the majority of which are coordinated by the spinal cord so that they happen without us having to consciously think too hard about it. So one of the case study activity portions concerns a man who does not have any proprioceptive information, and that guy has to look at a limb and selectively activate his muscle groups one at a time in order to produce any movement. And so something like walking for him is going to be really challenging because the reflex arcs for these motor patterns do include afferent information from proprioceptors, and if you didn't have those, you wouldn't be able to coordinate the reflex. So just think about that as you delve into the case study. So walking, jumping, all of these can be modified by the brain to produce like different fun kinds of jumps or modulate your walking pace. But there is, I think if you take the time to think about your experience of walking, a lot of stuff that you just do automatically and you don't really have to think about. And those are reflexes as well. Okay, so the reinforcement and inhibition section you're going to have to read on your own. It is still fair game. So if you have any questions about it, a good time to ask that would be, during or in between labs in person. But it's basically what it sounds like. So if you want to reinforce or amplify a reaction versus if you want to inhibit one within motor patterns, so just go ahead and read that. And then earlier, I actually mentioned the Babinski sign and diagnostic reflexes. So these are used to test a variety of nervous or sensory and motor functions or lack thereof. So this one is the Babinski sign, which is interesting because it changes depending on whether you're an infant or an adult. So also the test for it's uncomfortable. So if you use the other end of the patellar reflex mallet to run the handle of it on the bottom of the foot from the heel to the toe, you get this involuntary curling of the toes. And that's because basically descending inhibition is going to create this foot shape. And then in the absence of that, we have the baby Babinski sign, so positive Babinski reflex. And this is just because babies' nervous systems are not wired up all the way, they're not finished when they come out, and this will continue to develop and consolidate over time as the infant develops. So this is totally normal in infants, but pathological, meaning representing a nervous system problem in adults. So here's some other reflexes. We have the abdominal reflex, which basically if you run the little handle along one of the tendinous inscriptions, it causes involuntary flexing. The triceps reflex, the ankle jerk, the biceps reflex, all of these are basically bothering a tendon, and they're stretch reflexes to avoid damaging those tendons. All right, and that's it for chapter 13. So I'm going to just go post this and begin recording chapter 14. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next video.